On the morning of August 3rd, 1915, right in the middle of the First World War, a 21-year-old Russian soldier named Vladimir Kotlinski was standing high up on the massive stone battlements of the Ovich Fortress in Poland. As he stood there in the chilly morning air, he wrapped his military coat tightly around his shoulders and looked out over the vast landscape. For the past 6 months, this fortress had been his home, his prison, and his entire world. And every single day, when he looked out, he saw the exact same bleak view. It was a massive, wet, swampy forest that stretched out in every direction as far as the eye could see. The ground was thick with mud, and the air was constantly filled with a damp, heavy mist that seemed to cling to everything. But what made this view truly terrifying was not the swamp or the mud. It was what lay hidden inside of that swamp. All throughout the wet terrain, crisscrossing through the tall grass and the thick trees, were dozens and dozens of deep trenches. These trenches were long, narrow pits that had been dug into the muddy earth, serving as both a shield to hide behind during an attack and a launching pad to fire weapons at the enemy. And every single one of those trenches, which zigged and zagged all around the outer walls of the fortress, was completely packed with 7,000 highly trained German soldiers. Now, during the First World War, Russia and Germany were locked in a brutal struggle, and the Germans were absolutely desperate to take control of Ovich Fortress. To understand why they wanted it so badly, you have to look at its location. The fortress was built in a highly strategic position. It had a major railway line passing directly through its center, making it a critical junction. There was also a wide, deep river flowing nearby and a main paved road that ran right past the front gates. In wartime, whoever controlled this fortress had a massive advantage because they could easily move troops, heavy artillery, ammunition, and food supplies through this hotly contested territory. The Germans knew that if they could capture Ovich, they would deal a devastating blow to the Russian forces. But despite the repeated, aggressive attempts by those 7,000 German soldiers to take over the fortress over the past 6 months, they had all been completely repelled. And they had been repelled by Vladimir and a tiny, puny 900-man Russian force inside of the walls. It was an incredible feat. The Russians were severely outnumbered, they were low on supplies, and they were completely cut off from the rest of their army. Yet, every single time the Germans charged out of their trenches and rushed the walls, the Russians would stand their ground and fight back with such fierce determination that the Germans were forced to retreat back into the mud. And so, by that morning of August 3rd, 1915, as Vladimir was standing atop the battlements and looking out over the misty trenches, a strange sort of peace had settled over the area. It was like both the Russians and the Germans had reached a complete stalemate. Neither side was trying to launch an attack, and neither side was willing to pack up and leave. They were just kind of staying put, hunkered down in their respective positions, and doing absolutely nothing. In fact, over the previous few weeks, there had been so little action from either side that the Russian soldiers inside the fortress had become incredibly bored. There was only so much cleaning, card playing, and sleeping a soldier could do before the boredom became unbearable. And so, to pass the time and keep themselves sane, some of the Russian soldiers began sneaking out of a small, hidden side door of the fortress. They would creep down to the edge of the nearby river and try to catch fish with their bare hands. It was a silly, dangerous game, but it gave them something to do, and it brought a little bit of laughter and excitement to an otherwise miserable situation. But on this particular morning, as Vladimir stood watching the quiet forest, his eyes caught something unusual. He focused his gaze on one of the German trenches that was located closest to the fortress walls. Even though it was still several hundred feet away, the air was clear enough for him to see down into the trench, and what he saw made him pause. There was a tight cluster of high-ranking German officers huddled together in a small circle. They were not holding weapons, and they were not preparing for a charge. Instead, they were acting very strangely. They would all look down at the ground at something inside of the trench that Vladimir could not see from his high vantage point. Then, they would all look up at the sky, wave their hands around in the air as if they were testing something, and then they would look back down at the ground again. Vladimir had absolutely no idea what they were doing. He squinted, trying to get a better look, but the muddy walls of the trench blocked his view of whatever was on the ground. When he looked up into the sky where the officers were pointing, it just looked like a regular empty blue sky with a few fluffy clouds. But whatever they were doing, it was making Vladimir feel incredibly nervous. Vladimir was a young junior officer, which meant he was technically in charge of other soldiers. But because he was so young and so new to the military, he lacked real experience and credibility. In the eyes of the veteran soldiers and the high-ranking officers inside the fortress, Vladimir was not really considered a serious leader. He was just a kid who had been given a uniform and some authority. And so, as Vladimir watched this strange behavior, he began to worry. He felt a strong urge to go and tell his superiors that something was wrong, that the Germans were planning something. But then he stopped himself. He was worried that if he went to the commanders and said he was concerned because the Germans were looking at the sky funny and waving their hands around, they would just laugh at him. They would think he was being paranoid, weak, and unfit for leadership. And so, after standing there for a few more minutes, Vladimir decided to ignore his gut feeling. He looked at the huddled officers and thought to himself that they were not shooting at them, there was no active attack happening, and everything had been quiet for weeks. So, whatever they were doing, it could not be that big of a deal. Why would anything change now? Vladimir turned away from the battlements, walked down the stone steps of the fortress, and went down below to hang out and play cards with his friends, completely pushing the strange event out of his mind. But the problem was, Vladimir had made a terrible mistake. Fast forward to 3 days later, on August 6, 1915, at around 4 in the morning. The Russian soldiers who were up along the Ovich fortress walls, keeping watch in the pitch-black night, noticed something incredibly strange happening out in the darkness near the German trenches. When they looked out across the field, they saw that the dark night air looked blurry and wavy. It was the exact same kind of visual distortion you see when you look at the air rising off of hot asphalt on a blazing summer day. It looked like the air itself was rippling. But of course, it was 4 in the morning in the middle of a damp forest, and it was freezing cold outside. There was no heat to cause that kind of warping. As the watchmen stood there, completely confused, they began calling up other soldiers to come look over the wall and help them figure out what this was. Within minutes, a small crowd of Russian soldiers was standing on the battlements, staring out into the darkness in stunned silence. And as they watched, the blurry air began to take shape. It was not just a distortion. It was a massive, thick, grayish-green cloud that was slowly rolling toward them. The cloud was incredibly wide, stretching across the entire width of the fortress, and the wind was blowing it directly toward their walls. The Russian soldiers had never seen anything like this before. They stood frozen, watching the cloud creep closer and closer, and then they saw something that made their blood run cold. As the cloud touched the leaves of the trees and the high grass in the swamp, the vegetation did not just get wet. It instantly turned jet black, shriveled up, and died. And then, out in the darkness inside the cloud, the soldiers began to hear a soft, repeating sound. It sounded like thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of dozens of birds dying midair and falling like stones to the forest floor. At this point, the watchmen realized this was not a natural fog. It was some kind of weapon. They began to panic, screaming and running down the steps to sound the alarm and wake up the rest of the sleeping soldiers. But as they ran, a harsh, sweet, chemical smell began to drift over the walls and permeate the fortress. It was an overwhelming, choking odor, and within seconds, the panicked shouting of the soldiers was completely drowned out by the sound of violent, agonizing coughing. It turns out that the strange behavior Vladimir had witnessed 3 days earlier was the German officers preparing for this exact moment. What Vladimir could not see inside the trench were massive metal canisters filled with pressurized poisonous gas. The German officers had been looking up at the sky and waving their hands because they were gauging the wind speed and direction. They needed the wind to blow perfectly toward the fortress, otherwise the gas would drift back and kill their own men. 3 days ago, the wind had not been right, so they waited. But on this morning, the wind was perfect, and they had turned the valves, releasing the gas. The mixture they used was a terrifying combination of chlorine gas and bromine gas. On their own, both of these gases are highly toxic, but when you mix them together, they become exponentially more lethal. The gas mixture is designed to seek out moisture. The moment it comes into contact with water, it undergoes a chemical reaction and turns into highly concentrated hydrochloric acid. If a person inhales this gas without a gas mask, the gas immediately binds to the moisture inside their lungs, turning their internal fluids into acid. The acid then literally dissolves their lung tissue from the inside out. At the same time, the gas enters their eyes, nose, and mouth, turning the moisture there into acid as well, which begins to burn and burrow holes directly into their skull. It was a horrific way to die, and there was absolutely no cure. Once you inhaled the gas, you were doomed. But you did not die quickly. It was a slow, agonizing, hours-long process of suffocating on your own melting organs. Because chemical warfare was still relatively new at this point in the First World War, the Russian army had not outfitted their soldiers with gas masks. But the Germans had them, and they knew the Russians were completely defenseless. As the heavy gas settled into the low areas of the fortress, there was nowhere for the Russians to run. The fortress had no ventilation system, so the gas quickly filled every single room, hallway, and courtyard. Almost immediately, soldiers began screaming in agony. Blood began pouring from their eyes, their noses, and their ears. Men were falling to their knees, clutching their chests, and literally coughing up large chunks of their own lungs onto the stone floor. The Russians quickly realized they were being poisoned, and those who were still able to move began desperately trying to save themselves. They ripped off their shirts, dunked them into water buckets, and wrapped the wet fabric tightly around their faces to try and filter the air. But they did not realize that this makeshift mask actually made the situation much worse. The dry gas would hit the wet shirt, instantly turn into hydrochloric acid on the fabric, and the soldiers would inhale pure acid directly into their airways. The situation was completely hopeless. They were trapped inside a poison-filled tomb, and outside, thousands of German soldiers were waiting to kill anyone who survived. Vladimir Kotlinski was one of the few men who had managed to stay on his feet. He stumbled through the green mist, gasping for breath, and made his way to a narrow slit in the stone wall to look outside. Through the green haze, he saw a terrifying sight. The German infantry had climbed out of their trenches and were charging toward the fortress. They were firing machine guns, and their artillery was pounding the walls. They were only minutes away from reaching the front gates, and once they got inside, they would easily massacre the remaining survivors. But Vladimir's reaction to this was not fear or sadness. Instead, as he stood there choking on the gas, he felt a sudden, powerful surge of motivation. He thought to himself that if they were going to die anyway, they were going to make the Germans pay the heaviest price possible. Vladimir had a reputation for being completely fearless. Over the past 6 months, whenever a battle broke out, he was always the first to run to the front lines. He had repeatedly risked his life to run out into heavy gunfire to drag wounded comrades back to safety. It was like he lacked any instinct for self-preservation. And so, as the sound of German artillery echoed through the walls, Vladimir turned away from the window and marched back into the open courtyard. He found about 100 Russian soldiers who were still standing, though they were barely clinging to life. They were covered in blood, coughing up blood, and their skin was turning a sickening shade of gray. Vladimir stood before them and screamed that this was their moment. He told them that they were all going to die, but what they did right now would define them forever. The sheer force of his words and his absolute lack of fear instantly motivated the dying men. They rallied around him, finding some hidden reserve of strength. As they stood there, bleeding from their faces and coughing up pieces of their lungs, Vladimir quickly laid out his plan. A moment later, with Vladimir leading the charge, this group of dying soldiers ran toward the heavy wooden gates of the fortress. They threw the bolts open, lowered their bayonets, and charged out into the green fog, screaming like banshees. The German soldiers on the outside were expecting an easy victory. They had been told that the gas would kill every single Russian inside, and that taking the fortress would be a routine walkover. But as they approached the gates, the doors swung open and out poured a crowd of men who looked like they had risen from the grave. These Russian soldiers were covered in bloody rags, their faces were smeared with black soot and blood, and they were literally vomiting up pieces of their own organs as they stumbled forward. They looked exactly like real, living zombies. The sight was so incredibly horrifying that it struck absolute terror into the hearts of the German soldiers. They froze in shock, and then panic set in. The Germans dropped their rifles, turned around, and began running for their lives back toward their trenches. As they fled, Vladimir and his army of dead men began firing their rifles, picking off the retreating Germans one by one. When they ran out of ammunition, they did not stop. They kept staggering forward directly into the mass of thousands of German soldiers. They picked up weapons from fallen Germans and kept firing. The retreating Germans were so terrified and desperate to escape that they ran directly into their own barbed wire obstacles. Hundreds of them became tangled in the sharp wire, and the Russians caught up to them and began bayoning them. During the chaos, a German soldier managed to break through and run directly at Vladimir. He lunged forward and rammed his bayonet deep into Vladimir's stomach, running the blade all the way through until the barrel of his rifle was pressed hard against Vladimir's belly. Vladimir stood there, looking down at the blade in his stomach. He knew he was dead. But instead of falling, he looked up at the terrified German soldier who was still holding the rifle. Vladimir spat a mouthful of blood and lung tissue directly into the German's face and began screaming at him. The German was so utterly terrified that he let go of the rifle, turned, and ran away in horror. Vladimir, with the rifle and bayonet still sticking out of his stomach, picked up another gun and kept shooting at the enemy. The Germans were so completely caught off guard by this terrifying counterattack that even though they outnumbered the Russians 70-1, they failed to take the fortress that day. The German soldiers who managed to escape back to their lines told the others that the Russians had literally turned into undead monsters that could not be killed by bullets or gas. The German commanders tried to order another charge, but the soldiers were so terrified that they absolutely refused to leave their trenches. Once Vladimir saw that the German retreat was complete, he used his remaining strength to call out to his men to return to the fortress. The handful of surviving Russians hobbled back inside the stone walls. There, Vladimir gave his very last command. He ordered his men to destroy the fortress's guns and ammunition stores so the enemy could never use them. Shortly after, every single Russian soldier who had breathed in the gas, including Vladimir, passed away. When the Germans finally mustered the courage to enter the fortress weeks later, they found nothing but ruins. It was no longer of any strategic value to them. Vladimir Kotlinski was posthumously awarded Russia's highest military honor, and his legendary stand is still remembered today in songs, stories, and monuments all across the country. Now, let us transition to a very different kind of mystery, one that took place over a century later in a quiet suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. On the afternoon of May 25, 2017, 42-year-old Nicole Gordon was lying flat on her back on her living room couch, clutching a cold ice pack tightly against her forehead. She was suffering from a blinding, agonizing headache, easily the worst pain she had ever experienced in her entire life. It was so intense that she could not bear to open her eyes, and even the tiny bit of light filtering through the closed curtains felt like physical needles stabbing into her brain. Nicole had absolutely no idea why she had this terrible headache. The only possible explanation she could think of was that 3 weeks earlier, she had been involved in a minor car accident. During the fender bender, one of her car windows had shattered and some flying glass had cut her face and forehead. But the cuts had seemed small, and she did not think a simple bump could lead to this persistent, horrific pressure in her head that had not let up for 21 straight days. But Nicole was an incredibly tough, independent woman. She hated going to the doctor, and she hated complaining. Even though she had thought about going to the emergency room several times over the past 3 weeks, she kept telling herself that it was probably just a severe migraine and that she just needed to tough it out. For Nicole, toughing it out meant spending her days in total darkness, only getting up to drag herself to the kitchen for food or to use the bathroom. She had stopped going to her job, stopped answering her phone, and spent almost every hour just waiting and hoping for the pain to finally break. As Nicole lay there in the quiet room, she heard the heavy lock on her back door click open. She did not panic because she knew it was her boyfriend, Durante, coming in. A moment later, Durante walked into the kitchen carrying a few bags of groceries. He put the food away in the cabinets, walked into the dark living room, and looked down at Nicole on the couch. He asked her how she was feeling. Nicole, barely able to speak, groaned and told him that the headache was still just as bad as ever. She asked him if he would mind going back into the kitchen to grab her some ibuprofen and a cold glass of water. Durante told her it was no problem. He went into the kitchen, retrieved the pills and the water, and brought them to her. Nicole murmured a quick thank you, swallowed the medication, and placed the ice pack back over her eyes, trying to slip back into a light sleep. But just a few seconds later, the quiet of the house was shattered by a loud, insistent knocking at the front door. Durante walked over to the front window and carefully peeked through the plastic blinds to see who it was. He turned back to Nicole and told her that her best friend, Lisa, was standing on the porch. He asked if she wanted him to open the door. Nicole shook her head and told him to ignore her. Even though Nicole and Lisa had been best friends for nearly 20 years, Nicole just did not have the energy to deal with her right now. Lisa was an incredibly high-energy, talkative person, and ever since Nicole had started getting these headaches, Lisa had been calling and texting her nonstop, desperate to come over and help. But to Nicole, even the thought of having a conversation was exhausting. Furthermore, she knew that Lisa and Durante did not get along at all. They had very strong personalities and clashed constantly. Nicole figured that if she let Lisa in, it would just lead to an uncomfortable, tense situation in her living room, and she just wanted peace and quiet. But Lisa was not the type of person to just walk away. She kept knocking on the door, louder and louder, and then she began calling Nicole's cell phone. Nicole's phone began buzzing and vibrating on the coffee table. Nicole reached out, grabbed the phone, and silenced the ringer. But a second later, it started buzzing again. Finally, Nicole looked at Durante and told him that she could not take the noise anymore. She was going to go into her bedroom to lie down in the dark. She slowly stood up from the couch, her head throbbing with every movement, and quietly crept down the hallway to her bedroom. She shut the door behind her and was about to climb onto the bed when she made a mistake. She wanted to see if Lisa was finally leaving, so she walked over to the bedroom window and parted the blinds just a fraction of an inch to look out at the driveway. But right at that exact moment, Lisa happened to look up at the bedroom window. The two women made direct eye contact. Nicole immediately let go of the blinds, letting them snap shut, but it was too late. Lisa started yelling through the glass, calling Nicole's name, telling her she knew she was inside, and begging her to open the door and let her help. Nicole felt terrible, but she was in too much pain to care. She crawled into her bed, pulled the covers over her head, and ignored the shouting until Lisa finally gave up and drove away. Nicole knew Lisa would be mad, but they had been friends for 19 years, ever since they had been pregnant at the same time and raised their children side by side. They had survived plenty of fights before, and Nicole was sure they would get past this one too. A few hours later, Nicole woke up to find the house completely silent. Lisa was gone, and Durante had left as well. Durante often only stayed for short periods to check on her before going off to do his own thing. Nicole dragged herself back to the living room couch and laid down again, hoping the rest would help. But over the next few days, the pain did not get better. In fact, it somehow got much worse. It went from a 10 out of 10 to a 20 out of 10. She could not even open her eyes without vomiting from the sheer agony. And as her physical state deteriorated, her relationship with Durante began to fall apart. Durante did not seem to believe that she was actually in that much pain. He began dropping hints that she was just being lazy and using the headache as an excuse to avoid working or doing chores. This deeply hurt Nicole, but she had no strength to argue. By late June, 5 full weeks after the headaches had first begun, Nicole was still trapped on her couch in the dark. One afternoon, she heard the back door slam shut violently. Durante walked into the living room, did not even say hello, and just stood over her with a look of pure disapproval and disgust. Nicole looked up at him, and in that moment, she decided she had finally had enough. She looked him in the eye and told him that they were completely finished. Durante immediately flew into a rage, screaming at her about how ungrateful she was, claiming he had been taking care of her for 5 weeks by bringing her groceries. Nicole did not have the energy to fight back. She just lay there, silent, letting him scream until he finally stormed out of the house and drove away. A few days later, on June 25th, Nicole sent a text to Lisa, letting her know that she and Durante had officially broken up and that she was welcome to come over. Lisa, thrilled to hear from her friend, immediately drove over and knocked on the door. This time, Nicole walked to the door and opened it. But the moment Lisa looked at her friend, her jaw dropped in horror. The apartment was completely pitch black, all the windows were covered with thick blankets, and Nicole was standing there squinting, barely able to keep her eyes open. She looked incredibly weak and frail. Lisa stepped inside, and as she tried to talk to Nicole, she realized something was seriously wrong. When she asked Nicole simple questions like what she had eaten that day, Nicole could only respond in strange, broken fragments that made absolutely no sense. Her speech was slurred, and she seemed totally confused. Lisa took Nicole by the shoulders and told her that this was not a normal migraine. She was taking her to the hospital right now. Nicole, finally realizing she could not fight this on her own anymore, weakly agreed. Lisa helped her out to the car and drove her straight to the emergency room. At the hospital, Lisa explained to the medical staff that Nicole had been suffering from a horrific headache for 5 weeks, which had started right after a minor car accident where she had cut her forehead on some broken glass. The doctors and nurses brought Nicole back to a treatment room and began checking her vitals. They checked the small, healed scar on her forehead to see if there was an infection, but it looked perfectly fine. They asked about her diet, hydration, and medication, but nothing explained the extreme persistent pain. Concerned that she might be suffering from a stroke, a brain bleed, or an aneurysm, they rushed her to the radiology department for a series of advanced imaging scans of her skull. After the scans were complete, Nicole was brought back to her room to wait. She lay in the hospital bed, feeling a sense of relief that she was finally in the hands of professionals who would find the problem and fix it. But only a few minutes later, the door to her room burst open. A group of doctors and nurses rushed inside, looking incredibly alarmed. In the middle of the group was a man wearing a formal suit. He walked up to Nicole's bed, introduced himself as a police detective, and held up a printout of her brain scan. He pointed to a bright, solid white spot right in the center of her brain. To understand what that white spot was, we have to go back to the night of the car accident in early May. Nicole and Durante had gone to a house party together. At the party, Nicole watched as Durante openly and shamelessly flirted with another woman right in front of her. When they got back to Nicole's house, she confronted him about it. Instead of apologizing, Durante got incredibly angry, told her he was breaking up with her, and began packing up his things. He then walked out to Nicole's car to grab some other items he had left in her passenger seat. Nicole, wanting to make sure he did not steal anything or vandalize her car, followed him out and sat in the driver's seat. After Durante grabbed his things, he got into his own car, which was parked directly in front of hers, facing the street, but instead of driving away, he just sat there, staring at her in his rearview mirror. Feeling a rush of anger and wanting him gone, Nicole started her car, drove forward slowly, and intentionally bumped the back of his car. She then put her car in reverse and backed up to her spot, glaring at him. Durante was furious. He threw his car into reverse, slammed on the gas, and rammed into the front of Nicole's car so hard that her vehicle flew backward and smashed into her wooden fence. Nicole's memory of that night stopped right there. In her mind, that was the entire accident. But what she did not know was that after her car smashed into the fence, Durante got out of his car, walked up to her window, pulled out a handgun, and shot her directly in the forehead. The bullet shattered the windshield, which is why she thought she had been cut by glass. The gunshot did not kill her, but it knocked her unconscious. Durante panicked, picked her up, put her in his car, and drove her to his mother's house. He lied to his mother, telling her that Nicole had been drunk, got into a minor wreck, and just needed to sleep it off. The mother, believing him, cleaned the bloody wound on Nicole's forehead with Neosporin, put a band-aid over it, and let her sleep. When Nicole woke up the next day, the trauma of the shooting had caused retrograde amnesia, completely wiping out her memory of the gunshot. She only remembered the car crash. Durante, realizing she had no idea he had shot her, just went along with the story, telling her she had cut her head on glass during the crash. And so for 5 weeks, Nicole had been walking around, sleeping, and living her life with a bullet lodged deep inside her brain. The detective and the doctors explained to her that it was an absolute miracle she was still alive. But because the wound had gone untreated for so long, her brain tissue had actually healed and formed directly around the metal bullet. The doctors told her that attempting to surgically remove it now would cause catastrophic, irreversible brain damage. Nicole would have to live the rest of her life with that bullet inside her head. She survived, but she was never quite the same, suffering from permanent physical and cognitive challenges. Durante fled the area, but after a 2-year manhunt, police trapped him in an attic. Following a tense standoff, he surrendered, was convicted of multiple charges, and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Now, let us move to another story of a sudden, mysterious death, this one occurring in the wealthy suburbs of Utah. At around 9 in the evening on March 3rd, 2022, 31-year-old Corey Richens finished tucking her 3 young sons into their beds. She kissed them goodnight, shut their bedroom doors, and walked downstairs into the spacious, modern kitchen of her luxurious home. Once downstairs, she called out for her husband Eric to come join her. Corey was practically bursting with excitement because she had received some incredible news earlier that afternoon, and now that the kids were finally asleep, she wanted to celebrate with her husband over a drink. A moment later, Eric walked into the kitchen. Corey gave him a massive grin, handed him a freshly poured drink, and suggested they go upstairs to their master bedroom where they could talk in peace. The two of them went upstairs, sat down on the edge of their bed, and Corey broke the news. Her small, independent real estate company had just found out that they were officially going to close on a massive deal for a 20,000 square foot mansion in Utah for $2 million. Corey explained that with just a few minor renovations, she could easily flip the property and sell it for $3 million, pocketing a cool $1 million profit in a matter of months. This was the massive break Corey had been working toward for years. She and Eric lived in a highly conservative, traditional part of Utah, where women were generally expected to stay home, raise the children, and let their husbands handle the finances. But Corey had always been highly ambitious. She wanted a successful career of her own, one that was equal to Eric's. Eric ran an incredibly profitable masonry business which brought in a very high income. It allowed the family to live in a sprawling estate at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac and take luxury vacations to Mexico and Spain every single year. Corey had stayed home when their boys were very young, but now that they were 5, 7, and 9, the couple had hired a full-time nanny so Corey could focus entirely on her real estate business. Sitting on the bed, beaming with pride, Corey clinked her glass against Eric's. They drank to their future success and talked about how this extra $1 million would change their lives. But before long, both of them began to feel incredibly tired. Eric, in particular, was feeling very sluggish. Earlier that day, he had received a medical allergy shot and it had completely drained his energy. They decided to call it a night, brushed their teeth, changed into their pajamas, and climbed into bed. But just as they turned off the lights and settled under the covers, they heard the sound of their 7-year-old son crying from down the hall. Both parents groaned, and Corey immediately volunteered to go handle it. Their middle son often suffered from intense nightmares, and the only way he would ever go back to sleep was if his mother lay down in bed next to him until he fell asleep. Corey gave Eric a quick kiss, got out of bed, and walked down the hallway to her son's room. She climbed under the covers with him, comforted him, and within minutes, both she and her son had drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, Corey suddenly woke up. She sat up in her son's bed, feeling slightly disoriented. She checked her phone and saw it was 3 o'clock in the morning. The house was dead silent and pitch black. Realizing she had slept there for hours, she quietly climbed out of the bed, tucked her son back in, and walked back down the hall to her own bedroom. She crept back into her bed, noticing that Eric had kicked off most of the blankets and was lying flat on his back. Corey crawled in next to him, pulled the blankets up over both of them, and rolled over to cuddle against his side. But the moment her skin brushed against his, she froze. Eric's body felt icy. Freezing cold, Corey sat up instantly, her heart starting to race. She reached out and pushed Eric's shoulder, calling his name and telling him to wake up. But Eric did not move. When she pushed him again, his body felt incredibly heavy, like pure dead weight. Panic completely took over. Corey grabbed her cell phone from the nightstand and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Corey was completely hysterical, sobbing and screaming into the phone that her husband was cold, unresponsive, and not breathing. The dispatcher tried to calm her down, telling her that emergency services were already on their way. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood was filled with the sound of blaring sirens. Corey ran downstairs, threw the front door open, and wept with relief as paramedics rushed past her and ran up the stairs to the bedroom. But the moment the paramedics reached Eric and checked his vitals, they realized there was nothing they could do. Eric was already dead. The first responders were completely baffled by Eric's death. He was only 39 years old, in peak physical condition, and had actually gone for an 8-mile run just the day before. He was a passionate outdoorsman who loved hiking, camping, and going on long hunting trips. The idea that a young, healthy man like Eric could just die in his sleep made no sense. While searching the bedroom, police noticed an old, half-empty bottle of prescription painkillers on the nightstand on Eric's side of the bed. They wondered if he had suffered an accidental overdose, but when they looked closer at the label, they realized the prescription was years old and the bottle had likely been sitting empty for a long time. When they questioned Corey, she was in a state of visible shock. She told them she had no idea what could have happened, but she mentioned that Eric had felt very sick and tired after getting his allergy shot earlier that day. However, both Corey and the investigators knew it was highly unlikely that a routine allergy shot could kill someone. Suicide also seemed out of the question. Eric was a deeply devoted father who lived for his 3 boys. He coached their sports teams, played soccer with them in the backyard, and took them on weekend adventures. His business was incredibly successful, and his wife's business was on the verge of making a fortune. He had every reason to live. The police told Corey they would have to conduct a full investigation and perform an autopsy to determine the cause of death. During the agonizing weeks that followed, as they waited for the autopsy results, Corey poured all of her energy into supporting her 3 sons. The boys were absolutely devastated by the sudden loss of their father. He had been such a massive active presence in their daily lives, and his absence left a massive void. The 5-year-old, too young to fully understand, kept asking when his dad was coming home. The older boys, who understood that their dad was gone forever, asked heartbreaking questions about whether their dad could still see them from heaven or if he could hear them when they talked to him. Corey found herself completely unprepared to answer these questions. She searched bookstores and online retailers for children's books that dealt with grief and loss, but none of them seemed to help her boys process their pain. And so, one evening, Corey gathered her sons in the living room and decided to try something else. She began making up a story about their father. As she spoke, she grabbed a box of crayons and some paper and began drawing pictures. She drew Eric with big white angel wings and a bright halo, standing on a cloud, looking down at his 3 sons who were waving up at him from the ground. She told them that their dad was now their personal guardian angel, that he was always watching over them, and that he could hear every single thing they said. The story had a profound effect on the boys. For the first time since their father's death, they seemed to find some peace and comfort. They smiled, talked about the drawings, and felt a renewed connection to their dad. Quickly, this storytelling and drawing session became a nightly ritual. Every single night, before bed, Corey would tell them a new story about their angel dad and draw a new picture to go with it. As the weeks turned into months, and with still no official word from the police about how Eric had died, Corey had a sudden realization. She saw firsthand how much these stories had helped her own children cope with their massive grief, and she realized that other grieving families could benefit from them too. She decided to compile her stories and drawings into a children's book on grief. After all, she knew there was a massive lack of good resources on the market for children dealing with the death of a parent. On April 13th, about 6 weeks after Eric's death, Corey was backing her car out of the driveway to run some errands. Suddenly, she saw a police cruiser pull into the cul-de-sac and park right behind her car, blocking her in. The driver was Detective Woody, the lead investigator on Eric's case. He waved at her through the windshield, signaling for her to stop. Corey put her car in park, stepped outside, and walked over to him. Detective Woody got out of his car with a very serious, grim expression on his face. He told Corey that he had some highly important and upsetting news that he wanted to deliver to her in person. He revealed that the toxicology report from Eric's autopsy was finally back. The tests showed that Eric did not die of natural causes. He had died from a massive, lethal overdose of fentanyl. Fentanyl is an incredibly powerful synthetic opioid that is 50 times stronger than heroin. Even a microscopic amount can be fatal, and Eric had 5 times the lethal limit of fentanyl in his blood when he died. Corey appeared utterly shocked by this revelation. She vehemently told the detective that Eric was not a drug user. She explained that the only thing he ever used was an occasional marijuana edible before bed to help him sleep, but he had never touched hard drugs, let alone something as dangerous as fentanyl. The detective nodded politely and said he understood, but explained that because of the findings, they had to open a criminal investigation. He asked for Corey's permission to seize and search all of the electronic devices in the home, including computers and cell phones, to see if they could find any messages between Eric and a drug dealer. Corey immediately agreed, wanting to help. But then she paused and told the detective that they actually did not have Eric's laptop. She explained that shortly after Eric's death, his business partner, Cody Wright, had come over and taken the laptop, claiming he needed it for business purposes. Corey told the detective that she and Eric had been having major issues with Cody for years. She explained that Eric and Cody had started their masonry business together and had been close friends, but their relationship had been completely ruined during an elk hunting trip a few years back. During the trip, Eric had illegally shot a bull elk, and Cody had actually reported Eric to the state game wardens, resulting in Eric getting a massive fine and a ban on hunting in Utah. They kept working together to keep the business alive, but they absolutely hated each other. Corey suggested that the detective should go pay Cody a visit and get the laptop back. Hinting that Cody might have had something to do with Eric's sudden death, the detective thanked Corey for the information, took notes, and left. But over the next several months, the investigation seemed to hit a complete dead end. The police interviewed Cody and searched the laptop, but they found absolutely nothing linking him to Eric's death or any illegal drug activity. There were no leads, no suspect, and no new information. Meanwhile, Corey focused all of her energy on finishing her children's book. On March 5, 2023, almost exactly 1 year after Eric's death, Corey officially self-published her book on Amazon under the title, Are You With Me? The book became an instant sensation. Parents from all over the country left glowing 5-star reviews, praising the book for helping their children deal with the loss of loved ones. Local television and radio stations began reaching out to Corey, begging her to do interviews to share her story of tragedy, healing, and creativity. Corey was initially terrified of the media attention, but she eventually agreed to do the interviews. She went on local morning shows, smiling and talking about how proud Eric would be of the book and how it was helping thousands of children across the nation. But what Corey did not realize was that her sudden fame was about to trigger a chain of events that would completely destroy her life. Ever since Eric's death, the police had been quietly and meticulously analyzing all of the digital data from the cell phones and computers they had seized from the Richens' home. During their deep dive into the electronic evidence, they had uncovered some highly unusual, suspicious, and alarming information. But at the time, they did not have enough physical evidence to connect those findings to Eric's death, so they had to remain quiet and wait. But when Corey went on her massive media tour, plastering her face all over television screens and news websites, it caught the attention of Eric's family. Eric's family had never liked Corey. They had always suspected that she was greedy, manipulative, and hiding something. They found the entire grief book tour absolutely disgusting. They believed Corey was using the death of their beloved Eric to gain fame and make money. And so, several of Eric's family members contacted the police department, demanding that they look closer at Corey. They told the detectives that they were absolutely convinced Corey had murdered Eric, and they urged them to dig deeper. With the family's statements and the pressure from the media, the detectives went back to the highly unusual digital evidence they had found on Corey's devices. And on May 8, 2023, they decided they finally had enough evidence to make an arrest. While this case is still ongoing and has not yet gone to trial, prosecutors have laid out a terrifying theory of what they believe actually happened on the night of March 3, 2022. That night, when Eric came down to the kitchen, Corey handed him a cold Moscow Mule, a cocktail made of vodka, ginger beer, and lime juice. But according to prosecutors, Corey had secretly dissolved a massive, lethal dose of illicit fentanyl into the bottom of the glass. It turns out that Corey had been secretly stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from Eric's bank accounts to fund her failing real estate ventures. She had also been secretly taking out massive, fraudulent loans in their names. Eric had recently discovered the theft and the loans, and he was absolutely furious. He had already contacted a divorce lawyer and was in the process of changing his estate plan and insurance policies to ensure that Corey would get absolutely nothing if they split up. Realizing that her wealthy lifestyle was about to end, Corey decided to murder her husband before he could finalize the divorce. She had secretly purchased a $2 million life insurance policy on his life, naming herself as the sole beneficiary. Investigators discovered that she had tried to poison Eric weeks earlier on Valentine's Day by putting fentanyl in a sandwich she made for him, but it had only made him incredibly sick with hives. So, she purchased a much stronger batch of fentanyl from a local drug dealer. While Eric was lying in his bed, slowly and painfully suffocating as the fentanyl shut down his respiratory system, Corey did not call 911. Instead, she sat in the living room for hours, using her cell phone to search Google for things like how to delete messages off of an iPhone, how to permanently wipe electronic data, and what kind of luxury prisons existed for wealthy criminals in the United States. This highly incriminating search history was the exact unusual digital evidence the police had found during their initial search, but they needed the family's testimony and the drug dealer's identification of Corey to tie it all together. Corey Richens was arrested and charged with aggravated murder and possession of controlled substances. She remains held in jail without bail as she awaits her trial, and her book has been permanently removed from Amazon. Now, let us transition to a very short, bizarre event that took place decades earlier in the mountains of Kentucky, illustrating just how quickly a normal night can turn into an absolute nightmare. On the night of June 8, 1989, in the small coal mining city of Pikeville, Kentucky, a young woman was standing on the second-floor outdoor balcony of a local motel. The air was thick and humid, and she was nervously pacing back and forth, smoking a cigarette, her eyes locked on the dark parking lot below. A few minutes later, a small light blue Ford Tempo pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver parked the car, turned off the engine, stepped out, and began walking toward the motel rooms on the first floor. The moment the woman on the balcony recognized the driver, she flicked her cigarette over the railing and began sprinting down the concrete stairs, taking them two at a time to cut the driver off before they could reach their room. Within minutes, the young woman and the driver were both back inside that small Ford Tempo, speeding down a windy, unlit mountain road, screaming at each other at the top of their lungs about what they were going to do next. The tension inside the cramped car was thick, and the driver finally slammed on the brakes, pulling over onto the dark shoulder of the road. What happened next inside that car was so unbelievably bizarre, rare, and horrific that when the FBI was eventually called in to investigate, they would officially state in their reports that in the entire history of the Bureau, they had never seen a case quite like it. While the details of that mountain road encounter remain shrouded in federal mystery, let us move to another survival story, this one taking place in the dense wild forests of Russia, where a simple afternoon of foraging turned into a literal fight for survival against a massive predator. On the afternoon of May 11, 2015, 55-year-old Natalia was walking through a beautiful, sunny forest in Russia with her 82-year-old friend Valia. The two women had been close friends for decades, and they shared a deep love for nature and the outdoors. For many years, they had been visiting this specific grove of birch trees every spring to gather sweet birch sap, a traditional Russian delicacy. They enjoyed the quiet peace of the forest, the singing of the birds, and the chance to escape the noise of the city. On this day, Natalia had also brought along her beloved little dog, a small, energetic pup who was having the time of his life running through the underbrush, sniffing trees, and chasing squirrels. The weather was absolutely perfect, with a warm sun filtering through the green leaves, and the two friends spent hours moving from tree to tree, using small drills and hammers to make small holes in the bark, inserting taps and hanging glass bottles underneath to collect the clear, sweet sap. Eventually, as the afternoon began to fade, Natalia decided they had gathered more than enough sap for the year. She began packing her glass jars and tools into her backpack, getting ready to head back to their car. She looked over and saw Valia, who was quite hard of hearing, sitting on the mossy ground beneath a massive ancient birch tree. Valia was completely focused on tapping one final tree, her back turned to the rest of the forest. Natalia smiled and began looking around for her dog so they could head home. She spotted him about 30 yards away, near the edge of a dense thicket of pine trees. But as she watched him, she noticed his posture suddenly change. The dog went completely rigid, his tail dropped, and he stared intently into the deep, dark woods. He looked like he had detected something highly alarming that was completely out of Natalia's line of sight. Natalia felt a sudden chill run down her spine. The forest was usually very safe, but she knew that wild animals lived in the area. She set her heavy backpack down and slowly walked toward her dog, trying to get a better view of whatever he was looking at. As she stepped past a large pine tree, her view cleared and she froze in absolute terror. About 50 yards away, standing in the shadows of the thick trees, was a massive dark shape. It was a giant Russian brown bear, easily weighing over 600 pounds. Before Natalia could even process what she was looking at, the bear let out a low, guttural growl, lunged out from the shadows, and began charging directly toward her little dog at a terrifying speed. Natalia screamed in horror. She looked back at Valia, but the elderly woman, completely deaf to the sounds of the forest, was still sitting peacefully with her back turned, working on her tree. Natalia's instinct for self-preservation completely took over. She turned around and began running as fast as her legs could carry her, desperate to escape. But after only running about 10 yards, she stopped. She could not just run away and leave her elderly friend and her beloved dog to be slaughtered. She spun back around and saw that the small dog was standing his ground, barking ferociously at the massive bear. Bear seemed slightly confused by the tiny dog's bravery, circling him and snapping its jaws, but not yet attacking. Valia was still completely oblivious, sitting just yards away. Natalia knew she had to act. She began walking slowly back toward the bear, waving her arms in the air and screaming at the top of her lungs, trying to get Valia's attention and scare the bear away. But the moment Natalia began screaming, the bear stopped looking at the dog. It slowly turned its massive, heavy head and locked its dark, cold eyes directly onto Natalia. To the bear, the screaming woman was a much larger and more appealing target than the tiny dog. Before Natalia could even turn to run, the bear charged. It covered the distance between them in a fraction of a second, leaping through the air and slamming into Natalia with immense force. The impact threw Natalia to the ground, knocking the wind completely out of her. Before she could scream, the bear bit down on her thigh, its massive teeth easily crushing through her muscle and bone. Natalia felt an explosion of white-hot pain as the bear began violently shaking her, trying to drag her deeper into the thick woods. She clawed at the dirt, desperately trying to pull herself away, but she was completely powerless against the predator's strength. As she was being dragged, her hand brushed against something hard on the ground. It was the small hand drill she had been using to tap the birch trees. She gripped the metal tool, turned on her side, and was about to thrust the sharp metal bit directly into the bear's eye when the beast suddenly stood up on its hind legs to its full height, towering over her. It then crashed all of its massive weight directly down onto Natalia's chest. The crushing weight broke several of Natalia's ribs, completely collapsing her lungs and causing her to drop the drill. The bear then leaned down and clamped its massive jaws tightly around her throat. At this point, Valia finally turned around. She was horrified to see a massive brown bear actively mauling her friend just a few yards away. Most 82-year-old women would have panicked and run, but Valia was incredibly brave. She stood up, grabbed a heavy wooden branch from the ground, ran directly up to the back of the bear, and began pummeling the beast over the head and back, screaming at it to get off of her friend. The bear barely felt the blows, but the noise and irritation caused it to let go of Natalia's neck. It slowly turned around, its face completely covered in Natalia's blood, and stared menacingly at Valia. Valia, realizing she had just targeted a monster, began stumbling backward in terror. The bear tensed its muscles, clearly preparing to spring forward and tear Valia to pieces. Natalia, lying in a pool of her own blood and barely clinging to consciousness, saw what was about to happen. She knew Valia would not survive a single blow from the bear. With the very last of her strength, Natalia began screaming and thrashing on the ground, intentionally drawing the bear's attention back to herself. The distraction worked perfectly. The bear forgot about Valia, turned back to Natalia, and began biting and clawing at her body again. A moment later, the bear picked Natalia up by the neck of her jacket and ran off into the deep forest, dragging her limp body away. Valia, left alone and sobbing in the quiet grove, knew she could not fight the bear. She ran as fast as she could back to their car, grabbed her mobile phone, and called the emergency services. An hour and a half later, a group of armed local hunters and animal control officers arrived at the forest parking lot. They found Valia in a state of severe shock, but she was able to point them in the direction of the birch grove. The armed men immediately headed into the woods. When they reached the grove, they spotted the bear standing near a thick patch of bushes. The bear saw them, let out a fierce roar, and charged. The hunters raised their high-powered rifles and fired multiple shots, killing the bear instantly. But as they looked around the quiet forest, there was absolutely no sign of Natalia. They feared the worst, assuming the bear had completely consumed her. But then, they heard a soft whimpering sound. Out from behind a thick pine tree came Natalia's little dog. Amazingly, the dog had survived the entire ordeal without a single scratch. The dog ran up to the hunters, barked twice, and then ran back behind the tree. The hunters followed the dog and found him standing guard over a strange, low mound of dirt, dry leaves, and thick pine branches. One of the hunters walked over, cleared away the debris, and gasped in horror. Lying underneath the dirt was Natalia. Her body was absolutely shredded, covered in deep claw marks and horrific bite wounds, but to the hunter's absolute astonishment, she was still breathing. It is a well-known and terrifying fact among wildlife experts that Russian brown bears often do not kill their prey immediately. Instead, they will seriously injure them and then bury them alive under dirt and leaves. This keeps the victim alive and warm, essentially serving as a natural refrigerator to keep the meat fresh until the bear is ready to return and eat them later. Natalia had been buried alive, earmarked as a future meal. She was rushed to the nearest hospital, where she underwent multiple emergency surgeries. Against all odds, she survived, though she would carry the physical and emotional scars of being eaten alive for the rest of her life. Now, let us move to another tense, highly coordinated event, this one taking place in the Netherlands, involving a group of dangerous men who believed they were about to execute a horrific act of terror. On the afternoon of September 27, 2018, a high-definition security camera hidden in the trees captured 6 men walking calmly toward a small red brick bungalow inside a popular holiday park in the Netherlands. A holiday park is a very common type of European resort that offers cheap, budget-friendly accommodations for families, featuring campsites, small cabins, swimming pools, and bowling alleys. But the 6 men caught on camera were definitely not there for a family vacation. Their body language was incredibly tense, their eyes constantly darting around the park to see if they were being watched. The apparent leader of the group, a man with dark brown hair and a thick, well-groomed beard, walked up to the front door of the bungalow, pulled a key from his pocket, and unlocked the door. He stepped inside, but before the other men could follow, he turned around and insisted that everyone take off their shoes before entering. Once all 6 men were inside, the leader shut the heavy door and locked it securely behind them. They walked down a short, narrow hallway into a spacious living room at the back of the bungalow. The room was furnished with a large L-shaped fabric couch, a simple wooden coffee table, and a few chairs. Once they took their seats, 2 of the men who had been carrying heavy black backpacks and large duffel bags set them down on the coffee table. The other 4 men immediately stopped talking and stared intently at the bags. The room went completely silent. It was clear that whatever was inside those bags was incredibly valuable and highly illegal. To ensure complete privacy, one of the men walked around the room, pulling the thick curtains shut over every single window, blocking any view from the outside. Once the room was in total darkness, the 2 men unzipped the bags and began pulling out the contents. Inside the bags was a massive arsenal of highly illegal weapons, including semi-automatic pistols, ammunition clips, and several sleek, black AK-47 assault rifles. In the Netherlands, gun laws are incredibly strict, and it is virtually impossible for private citizens to own weapons like these. Over the next 2 hours, the two men who had brought the bags began conducting a highly detailed training session, teaching the other four men how to properly load, chamber, aim, and fire the assault rifles. They practiced reloading quickly, clearing jams, and moving through rooms. The four students were incredibly excited, laughing and posing with the weapons. At one point, one of the men grabbed two AK-47s, holding one in each arm, mimicking a movie action hero. But the mood in the room instantly turned cold when one of the instructors reached back into the bottom of the duffel bag and pulled out a heavy, green canvas vest. He laid it flat on the coffee table and the students stared at it in stunned silence. The vest was covered in small, heavy pockets with thin electrical wires and detonator caps poking out of the seams. It was a fully functional suicide vest. One of the students, looking visibly nervous, stepped forward and allowed the instructor to strap the heavy vest onto his chest. As the instructor showed him exactly which cord to pull to detonate the explosives, one of the other men in the room chuckled and said that when the police arrived, he could take all of them down with him. At around 6 in the evening, the training session ended. The men packed the weapons and the suicide vest back into the black duffel bags. But this time, it was the students who carried the bags out of the bungalow, not the instructors. The group put their shoes back on, locked the front door, and walked out into the parking lot. The two instructors walked to their own sedan and drove away, while the four students walked over to a large, white, windowless cargo van parked at the edge of the lot. Inside the van was a fifth member of their group, who was acting as their driver. The driver hopped out, ran to the back, and opened the double cargo doors. The four men with the weapons climbed inside the dark, empty cargo hold, and the driver slammed the doors shut, locking them inside. The driver got back behind the wheel and began driving north toward the city of Amsterdam. That weekend, Amsterdam was hosting its annual Gay Pride Parade, one of the largest LGBTQ celebrations in the world. Hundreds of thousands of people from all over the globe were currently packing the streets and lining the famous canals to celebrate. The terrorist inside the van planned to drive directly into the heart of the crowded parade, step out of the van wearing the suicide vests, and open fire with the AK-47s before detonating themselves, aiming to kill as many innocent people as humanly possible. About 30 minutes into the drive, the men in the back of the van felt the vehicle suddenly slow down and pull off the highway. It did not stop completely, but began driving at a crawl. This was highly unusual, and since there were no windows in the back of the van, the men had no idea what was happening. Fearing they were being pulled over by traffic police, they quickly began shoving the rifles back into the duffel bags to hide them. But through a tiny, narrow crack in the metal partition separating the cargo hold from the driver's seat, one of the men peeked through to see what was in front of the van. The moment he looked through the crack, his eyes went wide with terror. He screamed at the others to get the guns out. But before they could even unzip the bags, the rear doors of the van were violently blown open. The men grabbed their rifles and began pulling the triggers, aiming at the open doors, but to their absolute horror, the guns made nothing but a useless clicking sound. The weapons were completely fake, made of solid plastic and painted metal. The suicide vests were filled with harmless modeling clay and fake wires. A second later, a team of heavily armed Dutch police commandos, accompanied by large, fierce attack dogs, swarmed into the back of the van. The dogs jumped inside, viciously biting the screaming terrorists, while the commandos used their weapons to strike and subdue the men. It turns out that the entire operation had been a highly successful sting. The two instructors who had provided the weapons and the training were actually elite undercover counterterrorism officers who had successfully infiltrated the terrorist cell months earlier. Every single weapon, wire, and explosive they had provided was a completely harmless replica. The holiday bungalow had been completely wiretapped with hidden cameras and microphones, capturing every single second of their plotting. The 5 terrorists, along with 2 other co-conspirators, were arrested and later sentenced to lengthy prison terms, and the Amsterdam Pride Parade went off without any violence. Finally, let us close with one of the most terrifying medical anomalies ever recorded, taking place in the hot, crowded city of La Victoria, Venezuela, where a young man experienced a literal resurrection in the most horrifying place imaginable. On the afternoon of September 6, 2007, 33-year-old Carlos Camejo suddenly woke up feeling absolutely freezing cold and completely disoriented. He tried to lift his arm to feel his face, but his muscles would not respond. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids felt like they were glued shut. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in total darkness, and his mind was filled with a rising sense of panic. Carlos tried to calm himself down and think. He began playing back his memory of the day, trying to figure out where he was and how he had ended up in this state. He remembered that it had been a beautiful, hot, sunny day, and his friend had called him up to go for a motorcycle ride through the winding streets of La Victoria. Carlos loved riding his bike, but since he had gotten married and settled down, he rarely had the time. He remembered putting on his helmet, starting up his bike, and feeling the warm wind on his face as he followed his friend down a long, straight avenue. He remembered making a sharp right turn and then nothing. His memory went completely black. As Carlos lay there trying to make sense of the blank spot in his memory, he began to analyze his physical sensation. He realized he was lying flat on his back on an incredibly cold, hard metal surface. There was a hard, uncomfortable wooden block placed directly underneath his upper back, right between his shoulder blades, which forced his chest to arch upward and caused his arms to dangle uselessly down at his sides. It was a highly unnatural and painful position. And then, through the silence, he began to hear the faint sound of muffled voices nearby. Carlos felt a wave of relief. He thought to himself that he must have been in a bad motorcycle accident and that he was currently in a hospital emergency room. He figured the doctors and nurses were standing nearby and that they would soon give him medicine to help him move. A moment later, he felt the presence of two people stepping up to the side of the metal table. But instead of speaking to him or checking his pulse, Carlos felt something cold, sharp, and metallic press firmly against his chin. He wanted to scream to tell them that he was awake and that he could feel everything, but his vocal cords were completely frozen. And then he heard a terrifying sound. It was a loud, mechanical, high-pitched whirring sound, like a small engine starting up right next to his head. Before he could process what the sound was, he felt an incredibly sharp, burning pain in his chin. It felt like a thick needle was being forced directly through his skin, dragging a heavy thread behind it. He felt the needle exit the skin, pull tight, and then pierce his flesh again, stitching his chin together without any form of painkiller or anesthetic. The sheer agonizing pain of the needle was so intense that it did not keep him paralyzed. Instead, the raw adrenaline caused his nervous system to reboot. Carlos's eyes snapped open. The bright, harsh fluorescent lights overhead completely blinded him for a second, but as his vision cleared, he looked up and saw two men standing over him. They were wearing thick plastic goggles, heavy rubber aprons, and paper face masks, and one of them was holding a large curved suture needle with thick black thread. The two men were staring down at Carlos, their eyes wide with absolute pure horror. They dropped their tools, took several steps back, and began trembling. Carlos, finally able to move, slowly lifted his head off the metal table and looked down at his own body. He was completely naked, and drawn directly onto his chest in dark, thick marker was a massive capital letter Y. The lines of the Y started at his shoulders, came down to meet at his breastbone, and then ran straight down the center of his stomach to his pelvis. Right next to the table on a stainless steel tray was a small, circular electric bone saw, which was still vibrating and whirring. In that terrifying moment, Carlos realized exactly where he was. He was not in a hospital emergency room, he was in the city morgue. Earlier that day, when he had made that sharp right turn on his motorcycle, he had crashed head-on into a large, illegally parked truck at high speed. He had been thrown from his bike, smashing into the pavement. When the paramedics arrived, they checked his vitals, found no pulse, and officially pronounced him dead at the scene. He was zipped into a body bag and transported to the morgue for a standard autopsy. The medical examiners had placed him on the autopsy table, put the block under his shoulders to arch his chest, and drew the Y incision lines where they were about to use the electric saw to cut his chest open. But right before they made the first cut, they noticed that fresh, bright red blood was actively trickling from a small cut on Carlos's chin. Since dead bodies do not have a beating heart, they do not bleed fresh blood. Confused, the doctor decided to quickly stitch the cut closed to keep the body clean before starting the autopsy. It was the agonizing pain of the autopsy needle that had literally brought Carlos back to life, saving him from being cut open and dissected while fully conscious. The terrified doctors quickly realized their massive mistake. They helped Carlos off the table, wrapped him in a blanket, and moved him into the hallway. But instead of apologizing or rushing him to an actual hospital unit, the embarrassed staff simply left him sitting on a gurney in the hallway with his official autopsy authorization paperwork still tucked into his pocket. That is exactly where his grieving wife found him hours later, when she arrived at the morgue to identify her husband's body. Carlos had suffered severe physical injuries from the initial motorcycle crash, but he would make a full recovery, forever grateful for the painful stitch that had saved his life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.